In the middle of the 14th century, people went to sleep perfectly healthy and never woke up the same again. A fever would arrive without a whisper of warning. Dark, swollen masses erupted beneath the arms, along the neck, in the groin. There was no time to pray, no time to say goodbye. Within days, sometimes within hours, entire households went quiet. Parents, children, grandparents, gone. Not one by one, but all at once. Church bells rang so continuously across the cities of Europe that officials eventually stopped trying to count the dead. Graveyards ran out of room. Streets that had once hummed with merchants' children and laughter fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. And in that silence, one question haunted every surviving soul from Lisbon to London. Was this the end of the world? What those terrified people could not have known, what nobody understood at the time, was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic in all of recorded human history. A catastrophe so vast, so indiscriminate, so total, that it would consume up to half of Europe's entire population and permanently alter the course of civilization. This was the Black Death. And once it had begun, there was no stopping it. To truly grasp the scale of what was about to happen, we need to understand exactly what was destroyed. Because the world that the Black Death consumed was not a world of darkness and ignorance, as we so often imagine the medieval period to be. Quite the opposite. The early 14th century was, by nearly every measure, a high point of European civilization. This was the apex of the High Middle Ages, an era of remarkable stability, explosive population growth, and global connectivity not seen in Europe since the height of the Roman Empire. A climatic phenomenon historians call the medieval warm period had blessed generations of farmers with unusually productive harvests. The continent's population had nearly doubled in just 2 centuries. Cities were bursting at the seams, spilling past their ancient Roman walls in every direction. Paris, Florence, Venice, London, these were not sleepy backwaters. They were dense, roaring, chaotic engines of human energy, culture, and ambition. Towering Gothic cathedrals were being raised across the landscape, not merely as places of worship, but as monuments to a society that genuinely believed it was ascending. Closer to God, more capable than its ancestors, more permanent, and connecting it all was something truly extraordinary. A global trading network secured by the reach of the Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the shores of the Mediterranean. Historians call this era the Pax Mongolica. A Venetian merchant in his counting house could handle silk that had traveled the entire breadth of Asia without ever leaving a protected trade corridor. Spices, gold, textiles, mathematics, astronomical knowledge, it moved with a speed and scale that the ancient world would have considered miraculous. It was, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of the internet. A worldwide web of goods and ideas woven across entire continents. It was glorious. It was optimistic. It was deeply, fatally interconnected. Because the same ships that carried cinnamon and silk were about to carry something else entirely. The infrastructure for the greatest disaster in human history had been perfectly unknowingly constructed. This society, so prosperous, so confident, so thoroughly networked, was about to face an enemy it could not see, could not name, and absolutely could not fight. The origin of the catastrophe lay thousands of miles from the stone spires of European cathedrals, out in the vast wind-scoured grasslands of Central Asia, somewhere in the region of what is now Kyrgyzstan or northern China. This is a land of extremes, endless horizons, brutal winters, summers that bake the earth bone dry. Here, in the burrowing rodent populations of those steppes, the marmots, the ground squirrels, a bacterium had existed for millennia in quiet biological equilibrium. Its name was Yersinia pestis. and for centuries, it had been content to remain exactly where it was, cycling through its animal hosts, far from any significant human population, perfectly balanced, perfectly contained. But then, in the 1330s, something disturbed that balance. Climate historians point to a period of severe ecological stress in the region, drought followed by flooding, that devastated the food sources of those rodent populations. Driven by hunger, infected animals began migrating, moving closer to human settlements, and with them, they brought their fleas. The jump from rodent to human happened somewhere along the arteries of the Silk Road, in the trading outposts and caravanserais of Central Asia. The first human victims almost certainly had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. High fevers, violent vomiting. And then, the defining horror, agonizing, grotesque swellings erupting in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpit, the neck, the buboes that would eventually give this plague its common name. In the ancient world, information moved slowly, but the rumor of disaster travels faster than any caravan. By the early 1340s, fragmented, terrifying reports were already filtering into the ports of the Mediterranean. Merchants returning from the east spoke of entire civilizations disappearing, of reigns of fire, of pestilence so total that the lands of India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia had been emptied of their people. The Europeans who heard these stories absorbed them with a mixture of distant horror and comfortable detachment. These were tragedies in exotic, faraway lands, perhaps divine punishment visited upon peoples of foreign faith. Nobody connected the spices on their dinner tables to the road that was carrying their doom. The geographical hinge point of this entire story is a city most people have never heard of, Kaffa, a magnificent, heavily fortified Genoese colony perched on the Crimean Peninsula, jutting out into the northern Black Sea. Kaffa was not simply a prosperous town. It was arguably the most strategically vital commercial hub on Earth, the critical link between the overland Silk Road routes from Asia and the maritime trade networks of the Mediterranean. Within its massive stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a cosmopolitan mix of peoples from across the known world, all protected by the finest crossbowmen Genoa could afford. In 1346, Kaffa was besieged. The army of the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire commanded by Khan Jani Beg, had surrounded the city. The Genoese were expert defenders, skilled at maritime resupply, and the siege ground on for months in grinding stalemate. Then, without warning, the Black Death came for the besiegers. Living in packed conditions with virtually no sanitation, the Mongol camps became a perfect incubator for the bacterium that had followed them out of Central Asia. Soldiers began dying in their hundreds, then their thousands, their skin darkening, their bodies breaking down before death. The mightiest army in the region was not being defeated by walls or weapons, it was being dissolved by something invisible. Watching his forces disintegrate around him, Jani Beg made a decision that would echo across centuries. In an act of calculated, cold-blooded desperation, one of the first documented uses of biological warfare in history, he ordered the corpses of his plague-dead soldiers loaded onto siege trebuchets. For days, the sky over Kaffa rained bodies. The Genoese defenders stared in stunned horror as pestilent corpses arched over the walls and crashed into courtyards, market squares, and rooftops. The psychological terror was immediate and overwhelming, but the biological impact was worse. The bacteria, carried in the fluids of the dead, carried by the fleas that were abandoning cold corpses in search of warm, living hosts, it found its way through the walls. The city's defenses, impregnable against any army, had been breached from the inside. Panic consumed Kaffa. The Genoese merchants, men of extraordinary pragmatism, knew exactly what they had to do. They gathered their most portable wealth, loaded it onto their galleys, and they ran. 12 ships slipped from the harbor, past the dying remnants of the Mongol army and out into the open sea. They sailed through the Bosphorus, pausing long enough to seed Constantinople with infection, a city that would suffer catastrophically, and out into the Mediterranean, the greatest trade highway in the Western world. And those 12 ships, packed with refugees and invisible stowaways, became vessels of death, docking at port after port, leaving trails of contagion behind them like breadcrumbs on a map to the apocalypse. The first major European city to feel the full weight of what was coming was Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily. When the Genoese galleys limped into harbor, the dock workers who rowed out to greet them encountered something that contemporary chroniclers struggled to find words for. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies decomposing on the open deck. The few survivors were barely coherent, feverish, screaming in pain, their skin erupting with black oozing boils. The harbor authorities of Messina made the right call too late. They ordered the ships expelled immediately. But the true carriers of transmission, the black rats that lived in every corner of every medieval ship, and the fleas riding on their backs, had already used the mooring ropes to scurry silently onto the docks. The damage was done. Messina was Europe's test run, and it failed completely. The speed of the infection was paralyzing. The dense, winding streets and overcrowded tenements of a medieval port city acted like a furnace for contagion. Within weeks, Messina's social fabric had torn apart. Residents fled into the countryside in blind panic, and in doing so, scattered the plague across the entire island of Sicily. As news of the great pestilence spread, other Mediterranean ports scrambled to close their harbors to ships arriving from the east. But medieval quarantine was more aspiration than reality. Greed had a way of overriding caution. A ship loaded with valuable spices could often find a harbor official willing to look the other way. By early 1348, the maritime republics that had built European civilization were crumbling. Genoa, the very home port of the ships from Caffa, was being hollowed out. Venice, the jewel of the Adriatic and the wealthiest city in Europe, faced an existential crisis. The Venetians, nothing if not practical, ultimately pioneered one of the first systematic public health responses in history, the lazaretto, designated islands in the lagoon where arriving ships and their crews were forced to wait 40 giorni, 40 days, before being permitted to enter the city. It was a genuinely revolutionary idea. It is where our word quarantine comes from. But for the first catastrophic wave, it was too little, far too late. The gondolas of Venice became funeral barges, piled high with bodies, navigating canals that had fallen utterly silent. From Italy, the plague spread west to Marseille, the gateway to France, and east across the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The entire coastal perimeter of Europe had been breached. Now, the disease turned its face inland, following the river barges up the Rhone, rolling along the old Roman roads on the backs of cart horses and traders' boots. The plague moved into the dense, beating heart of medieval Europe. Cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona were extraordinary places, vibrant, wealthy, culturally magnificent. They were also, hygienically speaking, tinderboxes, narrow, winding alleys, timber-framed, multi-story buildings that practically leaned into each other overhead, blocking out the sun, open sewers running down the middle of the streets, livestock sharing space with families, thousands of human beings packed into spaces designed for hundreds. When the plague struck a major medieval metropolis, it did not merely kill its people. It killed the city itself as a living, functioning organism. And the horror of this was compounded, savagely, by the fact that nobody had any idea what was causing it. The finest medical minds in the world, the doctors of the University of Paris, the physicians advising kings, were completely, catastrophically baffled. They were not operating within the framework of germ theory. They worked with the ancient Greek theory of humors and miasma. the belief that disease arose from corrupted, poisoned air. A specific planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, they concluded, had released noxious vapors from deep within the Earth. The corrupted air was killing everything it touched. Their prescriptions follow a cruel, almost darkly comic logic. Do not bathe. Bathing opens the pores to the corrupted air. Burn juniper and rosemary in the streets. Aromatic smoke will counter the smell of death. Bleed the patient. The theory of humors demands it, even as it drains the last strength from bodies already fighting for survival. Lance the buboes, which, in practice, ruptured infected lymph nodes and spread septicemic infection through the blood. Every rational, well-intentioned intervention made things measurably worse. The slow, creeping realization that their most advanced knowledge was not merely unhelpful, but actively harmful, created something almost as devastating as the plague itself, a profound, shattering crisis of confidence in human reason and in God's mercy alike. Giovanni Boccaccio, the great Italian writer, survived the devastation of Florence, a city that may have lost 60% of its entire population in a matter of months. He left behind accounts of social collapse so vivid they read less like history and more like dispatches from another world entirely. The fear of contagion, he wrote, was so absolute that it severed the most fundamental bonds of human love. Fathers abandoned their sons, wives left husbands to die alone in darkened rooms. The sick were sealed inside their own homes. The machinery of daily life ground to a complete halt. There were no magistrates to uphold the law, so the law ceased to exist. Courts closed, bakeries went cold. The familiar sounds of a busy city, the creak of cartwheels, the cries of market vendors, the hammering of construction, were swallowed by a silence so thick and so wrong it felt like a physical presence. The only sound left was the constant tolling of church bells, counting the dead, until eventually the bell ringers died too, or the authorities banned the bells altogether, fearing the sound itself was driving the survivors to madness. The dead accumulated faster than any system could process them. Consecrated churchyards filled within weeks. Mass graves, enormous trenches dug on the edges of towns, became the only answer. Bodies were laid in these pits in layers, like timber being stacked for winter, with only the thinnest covering of earth between them. For the people of the 14th century, there was no separation between the physical world and the spiritual one. An event of this magnitude, this sudden, this total, this obviously beyond human causation, could only mean one thing. God was punishing humanity. Punishing it for greed, for pride, for corruption, for every accumulated sin of a civilization that had grown fat and forgotten its place. The church, which had been the bedrock of every aspect of medieval life, faced an impossible test. People flooded into cathedrals, packing together in prayer and mass procession, which, of course, only served to accelerate the spread of the pneumonic, airborne form of the plague through the crowds. Priests administered last rites until they died. Then there were no priests. When prayer failed utterly, a more radical, extreme piety took over. The flagellon movement erupted across northern Europe with terrifying speed. Bands of hundreds of men, robed and disciplined, marched from city to city in organized processions. Twice each day, in town squares and marketplaces, they would strip to the waist and flog themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood publicly. A spectacle of mass self-punishment designed to take the sins of the world onto their own flesh and beg God to relent. Wherever the flagellants marched, they left a wake of religious hysteria and social upheaval. And then, as the death toll kept climbing and prayers kept going unanswered, something even darker stirred. If God was not listening, perhaps the devil was responsible. And if the devil was at work, he needed human agents. A monstrous conspiracy theory spread rapidly. particularly through the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain, that the Jewish communities of Christendom were deliberately poisoning the wells, that this was not divine punishment, but deliberate murder. Pope Clement VI issued official condemnations of the theory, pointing out, with considerable logic, that Jewish communities were dying of the plague at exactly the same rate as Christian ones. His words were ignored. Centuries of institutionalized anti-Semitism, combined with the desperate human need to find something blameworthy, something controllable, something to punish, swept reason aside. Horrific pogroms erupted across the continent. In Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, and dozens of other cities, entire Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive. In their homes, in town squares, massacred wholesale. The Black Death did not just reveal the fragility of the human body, it revealed the fragility of human civilization. It is tempting to think of this plague as primarily an urban story, and in terms of pure speed and spectacle, it was. But roughly 90% of medieval Europe's population did not live in cities. They lived on the land, in small farming villages, in hamlets sometimes so tiny they appear on no surviving map. The plague reached them too, carried by refugees fleeing the dying cities, by traveling merchants and wandering friars. The Black Death moved slowly through the countryside, but when it arrived, it was no less total. Thousands of small villages, whose very names are now lost to history, were entirely erased. The manorial system, the economic and social backbone of rural medieval life, ground to a halt. There were simply no longer enough people to work the land. Chronicles from the period describe scenes of a strange, unsettling beauty made horrible by context. Harvests rotting standing in the fields with no living hands to bring them in. Herds of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly through the open countryside, turning feral because every shepherd was dead. Wolves, emboldened by the sudden inexplicable disappearance of the human presence that had always kept them at bay, moving closer and closer to the last surviving settlements. The carefully tended medieval landscape, centuries in the making, was being quietly reclaimed by the wild. By 1350, the plague had reached the very northern limits of the continent, Scotland, Scandinavia, and the remote Norse settlements of Greenland, which never fully recovered. The entire continent, from the warmth of the Mediterranean to the edge of the Arctic, had been touched. By 1351, the first and most catastrophic wave of the Black Death began, finally, to subside. The bacterium had burned through its most readily accessible victims. The fog of death began to lift slowly over a continent that no longer recognized itself. The numbers will never be fully known. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 75 and 200 million deaths across Eurasia and North Africa in total. In Europe alone, as many as half of all living people, perished in less than 5 years. The survivors stepped out into a world that looked, physically, almost exactly as it had before, but it was fundamentally, permanently different. The immediate aftermath was economic chaos and runaway inflation. But then, quietly, something unexpected and remarkable began to emerge from the wreckage. The staggering loss of life had created a labor shortage, unlike anything Europe had ever seen. For the first time in centuries, perhaps ever, the peasant, the serf, the man who worked another man's land held genuine bargaining power. Lords who needed their fields worked had no choice but to offer better wages, better conditions, more freedom. The iron cage of serfdom, which had defined rural life for generations, developed cracks. In many places, it shattered entirely. Historians call it the golden age of the laborer, a new social order born from the ashes of the old. But the psychological wounds ran equally deep, and they took far longer to heal. Art became saturated with mortality. The danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged as one of the defining artistic motifs of the era. Images of grinning skeletons leading kings, popes, merchants, and peasants alike in an inexorable procession toward the grave. The message was stark, deliberate, and impossible to look away from. Death had no preferences. It did not distinguish between the crown and the plow. In the end, everyone danced. The Black Death was the greatest collective trauma Western civilization has ever endured. It shattered the optimism and confidence of the High Middle Ages, and it forced a fundamental reckoning with the fragility of everything human beings had built. The society that eventually rebuilt itself from the ruins was harder, more skeptical, more willing to question the authorities, religious and intellectual, that had so utterly failed to protect it. The path of destruction we have traced across this story, from the steppes of Central Asia to the frozen edges of Greenland, ultimately cleared the ground for something new. Slowly, painfully, improbably, it helped clear the way for the modern world. For centuries, the Black Death has been filed away as a nightmare belonging strictly to the distant past, a medieval horror safely separated from us by 700 years of progress. But think for a moment about what it actually looked like. Empty streets, locked doors, a fear of the very air, the frantic search for someone, anyone, to blame, systems of authority failing in plain sight, the complete collapse of the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Does that sound like ancient history to you? Or does it feel like something else? The plague was, at its core, a test of civilization. And history has a way of repeating the tests we forget we already took. I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.